Hi everyone. The irony of me doing this as a PowerPoint video and not in virtual reality is not lost on me. Unfortunately, I couldn't really work around stuff in time and I needed to get this done, so I'm just going to do a boring PowerPoint presentation and not speak to you in a virtual environment, which would have been cool. This lecture, as part of the Digital Revolution module, Escaping the Real World, VR, Techno-Utopianism and the End of Innocence. Never let it be said that I don't have a penchant for the dramatic in lecture titles. And I know I'm obscure in my own name, but you can pick up these slides off Canvas as well. This is really, if you like, for those who are doing the MSc in VR, this is, if you like, a cultural studies, a very quick look at a cultural studies approach to virtual reality. And I guess that kind of fits for you other guys who are doing the digital media MA or one of the other MAs offered by the Department of Media and Communication. That this is, if you like, an insight into next-gen media and things which might become big over the next few years. Might, maybe, if, could, possibly. We'll see. So, in terms of the outline for this lecture, this is a two-part lecture, so the second video will deal with some of the questions around social media, for example. But really, in this video that I'm doing right now, I want to look at what is VR and why is VR important in contemporary culture. And I'm using social media as a mechanism and vehicle for VR, really for two reasons. One, I'm drawing on Jaron Lanier's discussions of VR and the potential of VR going right back to the 80s, where he saw virtual reality as really being a social medium and a medium for co-presence. And his arguments always in the 80s and 90s, when he was in charge of VPL, were that the social aspect of VR was always going to be the game changer. Being with others in a virtual environment was always going to be the fundamental selling point of virtual reality. I think we can critically question not maybe Lanier's vision, but what that means in 2020. So the second video is going to look at that really as sort of an applied aspect of virtual reality. This first video is going to look more at this fundamental question of what is virtual reality. Now, virtual reality has been around for a very, very long time. It's not a new invention. Indeed, in this book, which I largely take this lecture from, boom, wait, the re-emergence of virtual reality. That's me, people. Which was published in late 2018, so it's about 2 years old now. I outline a lineage of virtual reality going back to Victorian times in chapter 2 of that book. I don't want to go into that stuff now, and you can obviously, you can read the whole book in a couple of days. It's only a very short book. But virtual reality has been around much longer than we think. If we can trace the actual term back to 1938, and Artaud explained the illusory nature of characters and objects in the theatre as la réalité virtuelle. The English translation of this in 1958 is the earliest published use of the term virtual reality. And 58 is an interesting time because it takes us into probably the first virtual reality pioneer, and that is Morten Hellig. His Sensorama was, if you like, finished in 1962. One of the earliest, he started working on it in the late 50s, hence 58 being an important date. One of the earliest known examples of an immersive, multi-sensory or multimodal technology. And we could classify the Sensorama as a virtual reality system, although it is not digital in any way, it is all moving parts. You sit in a particular position, which is aligned with a unit which you put your head into to create a sense of, if you like, sensory confinement within a particular media device. Really like putting a headset on your head, which has speakers and so on, and hand controls. And if you like, the fundamental basics of virtual reality here in terms of its capture of sensory inputs in the human, if not sensory outputs, which is very important in virtual reality, are here in Hellig's Sensorama. moving forwards, a key name that we should all be familiar with, I hope, at least after today, is Ivan Sutherland. His Sword of Damocles headset was really the first what we call head-mounted display. Developed and finalized in 1968. It was used in things like Air Force training for the United States Air Force. Sutherland was interested in a concept called the ultimate display, a form of computational output which would integrate with the human perceptual system. And in this sense, Sutherland is really a cybernetics thinker. Cybernetics in the sense of cybernetics being the understanding of the integration of human and machine, and the fundamental science of understanding how humans interface with other machines. So Sutherland's Sword of Damocles should be viewed as really a form of computational interface. That this is a different way of using computers. Now remember, Sutherland is working before the WIMP environment, the Windows Icon Mouse Pointer environment, was popularized in the 1970s. So he's really looking at a novel and intuitive way for humans to interface with computers beyond the really primitive stuff that existed in the 1960s. Almost the WIMP environment sort of negates some of the need for what Sutherland saw in this cybernetic system we use in a head-mounted display. But the enduring sort of popularity and search for virtual reality over time does tell us that Sutherland was definitely onto something, that this ability to interface with computers in a more intuitive, natural way than using one's hands, using a mouse, using keyboard. I'm gesturing to these things. You can't even see that I have a mouse and keyboard. That's kind of interesting. That search for that kind of intuitive, perceptual interface between human and computer has been going on for a very long time. It really was the underpinning of Halig's Sensorama, and indeed Sutherland really should be seen as a cybernetic thinker and inventor who was looking to revolutionize the way that we interface with computer systems. And really, virtual reality today can be viewed in that sense. This is a new way to interface with computational systems. We are, deeply entwined with the WIMP environment, but with haptic technology coming through in the 2000s and so on, we do have different ways of interfacing with computers now, and virtual reality is another way, if you like, almost the ultimate way, by trying to create an environment where we are integrated with very closely the computational environment to the extent to which the computational environment responds to our sensory inputs and outputs. So the idea that virtual reality is a fairly new thing should be really tossed aside. We don't talk about 50, 60-year-old cars as new, so why would we talk about this kind of technology as being new? In terms of how we define virtual reality, there are millions. Definitions of VR have been numerous since the 1980s, when VR started to become a technology or medium that kind of resembles what we have today. So Lanier's book from 2017, Dawn of the New Everything, cites 52 different definitions of virtual reality, spanning a number of uses and a number of contexts of use. There isn't a singular definition in Lanier's work. So he offers things that draw out the importance of cognition, perception, dreaming, existentialism, phenomenology, in that VR emphasizes the actuality of existing consciously, empathy, and hallucination. I encourage you all to read Jaron Lanier's Dawn of the New Everything, if only for the reason that it's for a chunk of a book, and it is about that thick, it's a very, very interesting read. Not just about virtual reality itself, but about what working in digital media means in contemporary society. Lanier is a, if you like, blue sky thinker for the Microsoft organization, and it's really fascinating to look at how he got there and what he actually does. On a less ambitious scale, what do we have? VR has been defined as providing a more intimate interface between humans and computer imagery. That is very, very interesting. So, you know, the points I was just making about cybernetics and the development of a new interface, obviously Woolley's definition here emphasizes that idea of intimacy, the intimacy between machine or computer and man. A system that gives the user experience of being immersed in a synthetic environment. Immersed is very, very important. Immersion in virtual worlds and interaction with objects inform those worlds, given the part of the feeling that the person is a real participant in the virtual world. The idea of participation being important. Negroponte just describes it as being there. And you might think, well, that's very flip, isn't it? Just a two-worder. Well, actually, you need to unpack that quite a great deal. Being, as in the fundamental mode of human existence, human being, there, in that place, in that computer-generated simulation. There's actually nothing more fundamental that somebody could say about virtual reality than to say, we are being there in the simulation. And those are just many, you know, there are hundreds of definitions of virtual reality out there. I've just picked on a few here. They're all kind of similar, but they stress different aspects of VR in each definition. But what I want to draw attention to is the kind of activity that's described in them through the verb choices that these academics make. Immersion, interaction, feeling, being, perceiving, participating. Those verbs stress that any definition of VR includes activity. Virtual reality is not passive. And the experience of virtual reality, unlike our experience perhaps of television, where we sit as a passive observer of what's going on the screen, we are always active in virtual reality. Therefore, as a medium, virtual reality is not a cold, heartless medium which sits in front of us, much like you watching this video at the moment getting bored senseless. Actually, virtual reality is about being active. The virtual world responds to stimuli that it collects from us as users and re-renders that environment according to our inputs to it. So VR is an active medium, and the user is key in that activity rather than being sort of led and being excluded from what happens in that medium itself. And this is fundamentally different to most media. I mean, you can make an argument that you know, video games, digital games, for example, have aspects of this, and they do. But those digital games are always compromised by the possibility that, you know, by the actuality that the digital game is written, that it has a beginning and end point, that it has a narrative that has to be followed through. And even in open world games, I'm thinking, you know, Rockstar games, the typical ones, GTA, Red Dead Redemption, even massive things like you know, some of the MMORPGs that you can play online, they are still bounded by particular senses of what activity can and can't be. Virtual reality flips that a little by allowing more interaction from the user to shape the experience itself, which is less available in digital games. Albeit at this point in the development curve of VR, we haven't got to a point where we have a fully open environment yet, and that could be some way away. So, VR, a system that consists of a series of inputs from the user within an application that are rendered, and the rendering is really important, by the hardware of the system in order to produce an output that is experienced by the user as a virtual experience. Okay, I think that definition is really, really useful in terms of understanding what we're talking about when we say VR. The inputs of the user in a VR environment are a constituent part of that VR environment itself. And therefore, this is a radically different medium to those that exist within digital media, within mass media, and indeed within sort of entertainment media, and by that I'm sort of referring to the digital game environment. What we should be careful of is delineating what VR is, though. There is conflation of VR with other types of sort of mixed reality mediums out there. For example, augmented reality. Now, what I mean by conflation is, I don't think people identify them as being the same. and that would be kind of crazy if people did. But the conflation comes from the continual discussion of these things in the same terms as one another. And I think the actual aim of what AR is trying to do is completely different to what VR is trying to do. They sit on a continuum with one another. So, if you like, we have a virtual continuum where we start over here. We have the real world, this crap, right? Then we move across the continuum into the middle, where you could have AR, which sort of adds cues or digital objects over the real world, so a superimposition of digital data or digital objects over the real world environment through some kind of prosthetic, either it be a mobile phone or, as we're going to see very shortly, glasses. And obviously we've had the snafu with Google Glass, well, 8 years ago as well, but I think the next gen are going to be radically different to that, and they're going to be much better, and they're going to be much more scary in terms of data collection and surveillance and privacy issues as well. So we can move further across that continuum right to the edge where you have virtual reality. So in virtual reality, we have entirely virtual environments, artificially made environments. You move from the real over here across to the artificial, and so virtual reality sits at the end of this like reality continuum. So to conflate AR and VR is a very, very dangerous thing to do in terms of thinking clearly about what the aims are. AR is aiming to build a data-based layer of perception over the real world. VR is not trying to do that. VR is trying to build a new world entirely. And that's, so the aim of what virtual reality is trying to do is very, very different. That idea of building an entirely new world is why we should be really interested in virtual reality, and why it's fascinated me as a medium since I first heard about it, which would have been about 1991. The idea that you could build an entirely new world. It asks questions like, why would you want to do that? You know, what's wrong with this world? He says, as we just had the first Trump-Biden debate last night. What's wrong with this world? There's a lot wrong with this world. And the whole premise of virtual reality calls out to a sort of techno-utopianism that we could build an entirely new existence outside of the confines of what the real world is imposing on us, and all these limits to activity that the real world has on us, and the politics of the real world. We can build something better, something new, something outside those lines. At that point, you should be very, very scared, because the people who are saying that have their own politics, they have their own ideas and so on, and the imposition of those things on top of us could be a very scary thing. But that discourse about VR being techno-utopianist, that discourse surrounding it was every bit as absorbing and hyped as the internet in the early 90s. But it didn't deliver on that hype, whereas the internet did deliver on its hype, and so much more. It went way beyond what the hype of the internet was in the early 90s as well. And we can ask ourselves questions about why that was the case. So Martin Lister, in the book New Media, the enthusiasm for VR was part of the euphoric techno-utopian expectations of that late 80s, early 90s period. Heady mix of the computer counterculture and neoliberal Silicon Valley entrepreneurship. A period that was brought fairly abruptly to the end by the dot-com bust of 2000. And this kind of techno-utopian discourse really did characterize how people thought about VR in the early days. We're going to create entirely new horizons for humanity. We're going to create new virtual worlds which we can colonize as human beings. The discourses of techno-utopianism are very closely linked to discourses of colonialism, and in particular North American colonialism as well. We're going to take over the digital frontier, for example. That could be a phrase taken from any sort of Western movie. Why did it fail? Well, the technology of the 80s really wasn't mature enough. You could, in theory, maybe not in practice, but in theory, you could have perhaps generated a VR experience in the 80s and 90s which was convincing, which was usable, and which would have had commercial value. Unfortunately, the value of that commercial VR set would have been vast. To have the computational power to power something like that, and to have the hardware available to realize that, you're probably talking, for a low-end experience, $50,000. For a high-end experience, you might be talking millions. Certainly the technology of the time just wasn't mature enough to meet the aims and objectives of those who were working in virtual reality in the 80s and 90s. And therefore, this techno-utopian discourse around VR being the next frontier of the digital, and indeed being the next frontier of consciousness, the next frontier of what humans can do as human beings, was not realized simply because the technology could not deliver on that sort of thing. The vision was far ahead of the technological possibilities at the time. So in the late 2010s, the technology has begun, but not yet surpassed, to reach the vision from the 1980s. I don't think the technology is there yet myself either, but we still haven't sorted out haptics. We still haven't sorted out full sensory immersion into virtual environments. We're getting there. Things are improving all the time. The haptics is really the big one for me now, but we are starting to see that emerge. What we're not seeing emerge is the techno-utopian discourse anymore, and that will really be my focus of part 2 of this lecture. So how can we sort of come to a close on what VR is? The promise of VR was always that we could have a kind of worldhood, or feeling of being in a world that can be made in a medium that is totally immersive and absolutely artificial. So immersion is a feature of many kinds of media. The promise of VR is to intensify, perfect, and idealize immersion because of the sensory and interactive affordances of VR as a medium. We're locked away in VR. Our eyes are covered, our ears are covered, our hands ideally are going to be covered, or at least going to have something responsive to them. So we are in VR and we cannot be outside of it when we are in it. That kind of immersion is not a feature of any other medium. And building on that intensive, immersive sort of cage that is put on you by the equipment itself, you are therefore cast into an artificially generated environment. And given those two things together, there is the potential there to have a feeling of being at home in, or dwelling in, the virtual environment itself, and establishing a kind of worldhood which other mediums simply do not afford us. So that potential for building worlds, or the feeling of worldhood, feeling of being at home in virtual reality, is critical when considering the potential of VR as a consumer medium today. Just being immersed in VR world might be intense, but the worlds are contextualized and shaped by the world in which VR is emerging. So how VR is built, what it is built as, what it is built to do, is a reflection of the world in which we exist in. So VR applications, systems, platforms, and hardware are always the products of design principles and organizations that have ideological and political character. And that's going to shape the kind of worlds that we have. And I think, okay, a bit weird. What the hell are you talking about here? And it says, well, the people who make VR aren't apolitical. The people who are designing virtual worlds don't have, they're not blank slates. The worlds designed will reflect the aims and objectives of organizations who are paying for them. The worlds designed will reflect the aims, objectives, and politics of those who are programming and designing them. And we need to be aware of this. If we're going to cast ourselves into virtual worlds in a few years' time, if virtual reality becomes ubiquitous and cheap at entry, we're going to throw ourselves into a metaverse designed by a particular company with a particular set of organizational aims and a particular set of politics and social sort of needs and wants and desires, which will be reflected in the world that they have given to us in order to exist in. So to dwell in VR is to invoke the technological imaginaries of VR in films like Ready Player One, for example. It's kind of a benign vision of what a virtual reality world would look like for Ready Player One. It's kind of fun, you know, everyone's having a good time, everyone's having a laugh. I don't necessarily think it's going to be like that. That notion of the metaverse is actually explicitly criticized in a number of other sort of famous science fiction texts like Neil Stephenson's Snow Crash, William Gibson's Neuromancer, David Cronenberg's Existence. Even the Wachowski brothers' The Matrix has a vision of a metaverse, which is actually quite benign vision in the Matrix, but is there for entirely, you know, sort of heinous reasons as well. So that 1990s techno-utopian discourse of VR have been kind of reborn a little thanks to the advanced affordances of virtual reality today, but we also might want to pay attention to some of the sort of dystopian texts on virtual reality as well, which say that, you know, if virtual reality is dominated by single platforms or single companies, that's going to be hideous for us as human beings. I'm getting somewhere with this. You can see where I'm going in video 2, right? So the concept I use to describe the most problematic aspect of VR in contemporary society is the technological lag. Now, technological lag refers to is a reference to Woodward's cultural lag. The cultural lag is the phenomenon that culture takes time to catch up with technological innovations, and that social problems and conflicts are caused by this lag. I reverse that completely when we talk about things like VR. With VR, what I'm arguing is that there's a technological lag. The technology has had to catch up with the vision of the medium. So with this gap between what we wanted the medium to do and what it could do in the 80s and 90s, now that gap has been closed thanks to processing power, etc., etc. We now have a gap between the idealism of the original wave in VR and the realities and the structures of the digital economy in the present day. In short, the techno-euphoric utopianism of the 80s and 90s has been crushed by Facebook and others. And I will talk more about this in video 2. Thank you.